In our next presentation, we will explore the topic from a more general perspective. Welcome, Robin. Our next speaker is actually Robin Shields, Professor of Education at the University of Bristol. And your research focuses on the globalization of education and looks at it from a quantitative social science angle. We have asked you to put together an overview of what we know and what we don't know about international education mobility. And I look very much forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Julia. So I'm going to be talking about what we know and what we don't know. I'd like to start, however, by asking members of the audience to have a say, to let their views be known through a poll. So I've asked you all whether or not the benefits of international mobility in higher education outweigh the environmental costs. Are the benefits greater than the costs, for example, the cost of carbon emissions? If you go to this website, Robin, that's my first name, .2sli.de, so it's robin.2slide. There's a form to fill out the poll and you can have a vote. And as I talk, feel free to vote. And at the end, we'll look at what members of the audience think about this topic of the benefits and the costs. So what we know is that there are more than 4 million students around the world who cross an international border to undertake studies in higher education. These are degree mobile students. So these are the students who are doing a full degree abroad. This 4 million figure doesn't count students doing exchange, such as the Erasmus program or study abroad or short-term mobility or internship. So the actual number is probably quite significantly higher. We also know that this has a substantial carbon footprint, at least 14 megatons of CO2, quite possibly up to 40 megatons. And this is shown in the graph on the screen here. The bottom line is the number of students, and you can see it's grown from about 1.5 million at the turn of the century to over 4 million today. The middle line is the number of, or the carbon footprint of this mobility, and the top line is the global carbon footprint. And so you can actually see that carbon emissions from mobility are growing more quickly than the global total. And so, of course, we know that climate science predicts rising temperatures and many other effects from these rising CO2 emissions. I'm not a climate scientist, but the consensus seems very strong on that point. And so we can conclude that the models of mobility that are prevalent today are probably not sustainable, certainly environmentally. We've also seen more recently with the coronavirus that there are sustainability implications for university finance and planning. So international student enrollment tends to fluctuate much more widely than national student enrollment. So sustainability challenges are quite broad here. However, we know other things. So there have been many studies that have documented the many benefits to international study. For example, communication skills that students develop abroad, employability increases, increased confidence, and this has been corroborated in many different studies, even taking into account the fact that students who go abroad are a self-selected group. We also know that mobility greenhouse gas emissions are a very small part of the global picture. So although there is an issue of leading by example, in the big picture, this is not a significant part of the global footprint. In fact, it's less than 1/10 of 1%. We know also there is a long-term unfulfilled demand for air travel. So there are people who want to fly but can't over the long term. In the short term, there's obviously a large oversupply of airspace, but not in the long term. And this means that even if people were to stop traveling for mobility, the carbon emissions might not decrease, but rather these seats would be taken up by someone else. And finally, it's important to consider there's a rise of right-wing nationalism in some countries around the world. And so it's a time when it's problematic to kind of back away from internationalism. This probably wouldn't want to be the approach that universities would take to say that we'll be less international, because that becomes very close to kind of the nationalist populist arguments that are being made. Just to remind you, the poll's open there. I put the website on every slide, so it's robin.2slide. Don't hesitate to respond if you haven't already. So what don't we know? Well, we certainly don't know the future. There have been several decades of year-on-year increases in international students around the world. Next year will almost certainly be a substantial decrease. We can't say whether or not that will continue, and the longer-term trends may prevail, but we can't say anything about the future. We also don't have a clear way to compare the costs and benefits of international mobility. It's kind of like apples and oranges. So weighing up the environmental costs of carbon emissions versus the benefits of confidence and employability. It's a very hard thing to compare. We also don't have transferable methods of change. So whether this is organizational change, we've just heard a great case study from ETH Zurich, but each organization will probably be different, and we can learn from other organizations, but there's no cookie cutter approach to this. And political change is probably required too. Some more neoliberal systems tend to underfund universities with the expectation that this shortfall in funding can be met through international student enrollment. And so there's a need to perhaps create some wider political change in order to achieve sustainability in universities. So I'll end by saying what we can do. The first thing we can do is to measure our carbon footprint across the organization. And this includes flights by academics and staff, but also carbon which is deeper in the supply chain, if you want to use that metaphor. So what carbon is emitted for students to get to the university before they even undertake their studies. Peter Drucker, the management theorist, said what gets measured gets managed. And if anyone has something like a Fitbit, a device that measures your steps, or perhaps an app on your phone, you probably have found that once you start to measure something, you quickly tend to optimize it and to improve it. So measurement has an effect that will improve things. We can use virtual engagements where possible, and this seminar today is an excellent example, so there's no need to say more. We can seek to develop more sustainable models of international mobility. So train travel where possible is much lower in carbon. Combining trips, making less frequent trips is obviously an option. And we can prioritize equity and opportunity so that the perhaps most disadvantaged researchers, the newest postdocs, have opportunities for international travel before the more experienced academics do. And this offers less of an incentive for people to externalize the cost of their own career progression, I suppose, to pollute in order that they can kind of move up. So having your say, do the benefits of international mobility outweigh the environmental costs? It looks like about 60% of people say yes, and about 40% say no. So that there's some on both sides, and it's good to see that debate, because until now, this is a conversation that has not really occurred. So it's good to see that people are taking both sides of view. And no matter how you have voted on this, I think the main message here is that the environmental costs are not negligible. And until very recently, in the field of internationalization has kind of assumed that they are basically zero or can be completely disregarded. And so the challenge for the future is to continue the international mission of universities, but to also start looking at the cost in more intelligent ways that allow us to continue to develop internationally, but also to do it in a better, more sustainable way. So I'll end there. Thank you all very much for your time and attention and for your insightful views on that.